The first half of my talk, I'm going to be going over the Endangered Species Act and the recovery program to try to help recover these fish. And in the second half, I'll be showing you a number of photos of some of the structures that have been constructed to help recover the endangered fish and take them off of the endangered species or the endangered list. So with that, let me get started. The Endangered Species Act is a federal statute that was enacted in 1973. The purpose of the statute was to protect species of plants and animals that are in danger of extinction and to protect the ecosystems that they depend upon. And the goals are pretty obvious. The goal is to prevent the extinction of imperiled plant and animal life and to recover those populations that are in danger so that they become self-sustaining and no longer threatened by extinction. So under the Endangered Species Act, a species that's in peril can be listed under one of two categories. The most critical category is the endangered category. When a species is in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range, it can be listed as endangered, and a number of protections then apply to that species. The next step down from that is threatened. So the species is not currently in danger of extinction, but is likely to become endangered in the future if actions are not taken to protect it. For endangered or threatened species, the Endangered Species Act requires federal agencies to ensure that the actions that they take are not likely to cause jeopardy or jeopardize the continued existence of a threatened or endangered species. And so if a federal agency is going to be undertaking some action, the agency is required to consult with the Federal Fish and Wildlife Service to make sure that the actions they're taking don't threaten or jeopardize the continued existence of endangered or threatened species. Likewise, if a private entity needs a permit from a federal agency to do something, the federal agency will also, before issuing that permit, be required to consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service. So, for example, a lot of water projects in the West require federal permits, either because they're on federal lands or because they're doing something in a waterway which requires what's known as a 404 permit. And so for those types of things, before a permit will be issued, the federal agency will be required to consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service and make sure that the action doesn't jeopardize endangered species. So in the Colorado River and the Grand Valley, we have 4 species of endangered fishes. They're shown here. The humpback chub, the Colorado pike minnow, which in earlier days was known as the squawfish, the bony tail, and the razorback sucker. And so those are the species that, that we're concerned about here in the lower Colorado River. The critical area in the Colorado River for these endangered fishes is known as the 15-mile reach. The 15-mile reach extends from the diversion dam of the Grand Valley Irrigation Company, which is located just to the east of Palisade, and it continues on downstream to the confluence of the Gunnison and Colorado rivers. 3 of the species of endangered fishes use the 15-mile reach either as habitat or for breeding or both. So the pike minnow, the razorback, and the bony tail all use the 15-mile reach to some extent. The humpback chub is generally found downstream of the 15-mile reach, but flows of water in the 15-mile reach benefit the humpback chub. So the 15-mile reach is really the critical area that folks who are interested in the recovery of the endangered fishes concentrate on. The 15-mile reach is important for a number of reasons. It provides critical spawning habitat for several species of the endangered fishes. It provides a good balance between the right water temperature for these fish and the food availability for them. And it provides a refuge for them should a catastrophic event occur in the Gunnison River or in downstream reaches of the Colorado River. For example, a spill of diesel fuel, for example, the fish could retreat upstream to the 15-mile reach. And the 15-mile reach is immediately downstream of the major irrigation diversions on the Colorado River. And so during the irrigation season, when the major irrigation companies here in the valley are diverting from the Colorado River, that has a major impact on stream flows downstream in the 15-mile reach. So many of the efforts that are being made to recover the endangered fishes focus on the 15-mile reach. And the term recover or recovery means efforts are being made not only to make sure that the fishes are not going extinct, but to try to make sure that they have self-sustaining populations so that we can get them unlisted, get them off of the threatened and endangered list. So recovery is more than just making sure that they survive, it's making sure that they're taken off of the endangered list so that they can survive on their own. The Endangered Species Act is a federal law, has primacy over state water laws. And so the concern has always been on the Colorado River that if efforts are not made to make sure that the endangered fish can survive, that the federal government may come in and start shutting down water projects that are dewatering the 15-mile reach or not enabling new projects to go forward. So in light of that concern, back in 1988, a program called the Recovery Program was created by a cooperative agreement among the 3 states that I've listed here, several federal agencies, the Bureau of Reclamation, Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service, various energy producers and water users and environmental groups. And the goal of the recovery program was to allow water development to continue to occur in the upper Colorado River Basin, while at the same time allowing the endangered fish in this area to be recovered so that they're no longer endangered. And the recovery program has several elements that I've listed here. The first 2, the in-stream flow protection and reservoir releases and habitat restoration, I'll be talking about in more detail, so I'm not going to talk about them on this slide. Non-native fish management is a critical element of the recovery program. There are a number of species of non-native fish in the Colorado River, such as walleye, northern pike, bass, and those fish feed on the young of the endangered fish. And so there's an effort being made to remove the non-native fish from the Colorado River and Gunnison River systems to help protect the endangered fish that we're trying to recover. Another element is propagation and stocking of the endangered fishes. There are several fish hatcheries that raise the young of the endangered fish. Then those young are introduced back into the wild to hopefully prop up the populations of the fish that are naturally in the Colorado River Basin. And then the recovery program also does research on the endangered fish and is involved in informing the public and educating the public on the importance of maintaining the endangered fish in the Colorado River system. So what I'd like to do next is talk a little bit about the first 2 elements here, in-stream flow protection and habitat restoration. But I'm going to pause here for a second, Mary, and if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them now.
Nope, I'm not seeing any questions yet, Mark.
Oh, okay.
Go
Good.
ahead.
Okay, I'll continue on. So the first element I listed as an element of the recovery program is in-stream flow protection. And a little background on that. Colorado law allows a state agency called the Colorado Water Conservation Board, or CWCB, to obtain in-stream flow water rights. And an in-stream flow water right is basically a water right that allows CWCB to maintain minimum stream flows in certain reaches of streams in Colorado. And so, for example, the CWCB holds in-stream flow rights to benefit the endangered fish in the 15-mile reach. It has actually two decreed in-stream flow rights, one for 581 CFS, which I believe goes through the entire 15-mile reach. And then there's a second water right that they've gotten for the lower couple of miles of the 15-mile reach for 300 CFS. These in-stream flow rights are only effective from the period of July through September, but that's during the height of the irrigation season after the spring runoff has occurred. So that's a very low flow time normally for the 15-mile reach. And so that's why these in-stream flow rights were decreed for that time period. Now, the problem with in-stream flow rights is that the in-stream flow right law is a fairly recent development in Colorado. And so in-stream flow rights that the CWCB obtains are generally very junior in priority. That means that water rights that predate the in-stream flow rights can continue to divert. They don't have to honor the in-stream flow right. And so the in-stream flow rights can only call out or curtail water rights that are more junior than the in-stream flow rights. The 15-mile reach in-stream flow rights were adjudicated back in the 80s or early 90s, I believe. So in the context of the Colorado River, they're very, very junior. And by themselves, they're not much benefit in keeping flows of water in the 15-mile reach. So in order to prop up the in-stream flow rights and to give them more meat, there also is a program to release water from upstream reservoirs to help prop up those in-stream flow rights. And so, for example, in the Gunnison River, water will be released from Blue Mesa Reservoir to try to maintain flows in the Gunnison River to help benefit the endangered fish. And in the Gunnison River, the Fish and Wildlife Service tries to maintain flows of 1,050 CFS down to a diversion dam on the Gunnison River near Grand Junction known as the Redlands Diversion Dam. I'll show you a photo of that here in a little bit. And then the Redlands Water and Power Company diverts 750 CFS of that into their canal that takes water over to the Redlands area. And so that leaves 300 CFS below the dam. So the Fish and Wildlife Service likes to see 300 CFS flowing in the Gunnison River below the Redlands Diversion Dam to help maintain fish populations in that segment of the river. I'm more familiar with the Colorado River. That's where most of my work occurred during my career. So I'm going to spend most of my time today talking about efforts in the Colorado River, which is where the 15-mile reach itself is located. In the Colorado River, there are numerous reservoirs that are used to release water to help prop up water in the 15-mile reach. And I've listed several categories here. There are some dedicated pools of what people generally call fish water in several reservoirs upstream in Lake Granby, up in the Granby area, Rudeye Reservoir above Basalt, and Wolford Mountain Reservoir in the Kremling area. And these are pools of water that are available in these reservoirs every year that the Fish and Wildlife Service can call on to be released to help increase the flows in the 15-mile reach. These are very critical pools of water for the fish and are used every year by the Fish and Wildlife Service. In addition, Green Mountain Reservoir is a reservoir on the Blue River below Silverthorne. And there's a pool of water in Green Mountain Reservoir for irrigation and municipal uses here on the western slope. And when there's excess water or surplus water in that pool, that surplus water can be released down to the 15-mile reach also to benefit the endangered fish. A third category of water is water that's released by CWCB to supplement its in-stream flow rights. An example of this is Ute Water Conservancy District has a pool of water in Rudai Reservoir that's available to it every year. Ute Water uses that as insurance to make sure that it has adequate water supplies here in the Grand Valley. And Ute Water generally doesn't need that insurance water immediately. And so for the last 5 or 6 years, it's been leasing that some or all of that water to CWCB. And then CWCB works with the Fish and Wildlife Service to release that water down to the 15-mile reach for its in-stream flow rights. And finally, several organizations periodically donate water to either CWCB or the Fish and Wildlife Service to help prop up flows. The Colorado Water Trust has a program ongoing to buy water upstream and to release it to the 15-mile reach. And then Exxon Corporation has a big pool of water in Rudai Reservoir. And in very dry years, they have donated that water to the Fish and Wildlife Service to help flows in the 15-mile reach. So all of these different pools and sources of water in the upstream reservoirs are very helpful in maintaining flows of water in the 15-mile reach and for making the in-stream flow rights in that reach something that are meaningful in maintaining those flows.
Mark, I do have a question before you go on, and you may answer this later, but are the ISF or other fish water subject to the drought contingency plan for the Colorado Basin?
The drought contingency plan for the Colorado Basin, especially for the upper part of the basin, is an evolving plan. And basically, the drought contingency plan will try to send water down to Lake Powell to prop up the lake levels in Lake Powell. Any water from the upper portion of the Colorado River will flow through the 15-mile reach. And so I think the drought contingency plan will help the in-stream flow rights. The in-stream flow rights are non-consumptive water. It's just water flowing through a reach, and then that continues on downstream. And so I don't see the drought contingency plan as really adversely impacting the in-stream flow rights or the recovery program. I think it'll actually help it because it'll pull water through the 15-mile reach. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, while we're asking questions, another one just came in. How do water donations, for example, from Exxon, affect the status of the water right? Is there a risk to the water right holder of losing the right?
No, there isn't. There are different programs in Colorado statutes that allow donations of water like this without impacting the underlying water right. And then in addition, the Rudai Reservoir water that Ute Water and Exxon owns are permanent water supplies for them. And just allowing those water rights to be used for the in-stream flow rights in the 15-mile reach do not adversely impact the ability of those entities to use that water in their future for their own uses. So the answer is no, there's really no danger to these entities for allowing this water to be used for fish purposes. And any other questions while we're stopped?
No, that's it.
Okay. we're getting close to the pictures, so I'll kind of hurry through this, the rest of the introductory stuff, and then we can get to the photos. There are a couple of other in-stream flow issues I wanted to mention just quickly. There's a program known as Coordinated Reservoir Operations. It's abbreviated CROSS. It's a cooperative program that was established in 1995 by a number of upstream reservoir owners and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And the purpose of CROSS is to try to enhance the spring peak flows in the Colorado River in the 15-mile reach. And the purpose of having a good peak flow in the 15-mile reach is to remove settlement from the cobble bars that serve as spawning habitat for the endangered fishes. If you get a good slug of water coming through the 15-mile reach, it cleans out those cobble bars and improves the spawning habitat for the endangered fishes. And so under the CROSS program, the reservoir owners upstream try to coordinate releases of water that they normally would spill or otherwise not store to achieve peak flows in the range that I have here, from almost 13,000 CFS to 26,000 CFS. Normally these reservoir owners would just release the water that they don't need at times that most benefit them. But if they can coordinate these releases and do them all at one time rather than willy-nilly, then they can achieve these peak flows that will flush out the settlement in the cobble bars. And so this year, I don't think we're going to get up to the 12,900, so I don't think they'll do the CROSS operations this year. And looking back historically, it looks like they do the CROSS operations probably 50% of the time. If we have a good water year and the peak flows are going to exceed 26,000 acre feet, they won't do the CROSS operations either, because they are worried about flooding down here in the Grand Valley. So in years when they can achieve a peak flow of 13,000 to 26,000 CFS, they'll do the operations, otherwise they won't. Last year was a dry year, but I think they got up to 13,100 CFS, as I recall, last year. So they just barely met the 12,900 threshold. This year, as I said, I don't think they're going to be able to meet that threshold, so we won't do the CROSS operations this year. And then, oh, wrong way. And then finally, I wanted to mention something that's known down here in the Grand Valley as the April hole. The irrigators down here in the Grand Valley generally start their irrigation systems at the end of March or early April. And that's generally before the runoff starts on the Colorado River in earnest. And so when the irrigators start turning on their systems, it will create very low flows in the 15-mile reach, because the runoff hasn't started to help increase the flows through the 15-mile reach. That can result in dangerously low flows for the endangered fishes. And so in recent years, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the irrigators, and others have started having phone conversations in March to talk about the potential April hole and to take efforts to minimize the low flows in the 15-mile reach during the month of April. That can include some early reservoir releases, or maybe not diverting as much by the irrigators if they can get by with diverting a little less, things like that. So the April hole is something that people pay attention to. They've even started talking about that in some of the Daily Sentinel articles that I've seen about flows in the 15-mile reach. So I wanted to mention that so you'd know what the April hole is. And then the second element of the recovery program that I mentioned on an earlier slide was habitat restoration. This will include things like constructing fish passages or fish ladders at diversion dams to allow the endangered fish to get to habitat that's otherwise off limits to them because of the diversion dams. It includes putting screens on canals to keep fish from becoming trapped in the canals. And then there are also canal improvements that have been done to increase the efficiency of the canals and leave water in the river. And so this is where I wanted to show you some slides of each of these types of habitat restoration things. And the first slide here is a slide showing the Redlands Diversion Dam that I mentioned earlier. But I guess since I'm changing topics here, Mary, are there any other questions before I move on?
No, not right now, Mark. Thanks.
Okay. Okay, so this is the Redlands Diversion Dam I mentioned earlier. It's a low dam across the Gunnison River, just south of Grand Junction. The purpose of this dam is to back up the Gunnison River so that water flows into what's called the Redlands Power Canal. That's this canal that you can see up in the upper right-hand corner of this slide where my cursor is. And so this diversion dam backs up water into that canal. That water is then taken over to irrigate the Redlands area. And the water that's not diverted into the canal continues on downstream. So as I mentioned, the Fish and Wildlife Service likes to see 1,050 CFS in the river up to this point. 750 is taken out here, and then 300 CFS continues on downstream to help maintain habitat for the endangered fish. Back a number of years ago, a fish ladder was constructed around this diversion dam. That's what this structure is, where my cursor is going. And what this is a stepped ladder that allows the endangered fish to swim up the ladder and get to this area of their habitat that was previously prevented to them because of this diversion dam. Another fish ladder like this has been constructed over on the Colorado River side. I'm more familiar with that, so I'm going to switch now to show you some photos of that fish ladder. So that fish ladder is on a dam that's known as the Grand Valley Diversion Dam. It's often called the roller dam. And I'm sure most, if not all of you, are familiar with this. You see it when you're driving on I-70 into Beck Canyon on the way to Denver. This dam is a part of what's known as the Grand Valley Project that takes irrigation water from the Colorado River into the Grand Valley. So it's called the roller dam because there are a number of rollers in each of these bays in the dam. This structure that you can see, the water flowing over here, is one of the rollers. I'll show you some more pictures here in a minute. But what happens here is these rollers can be moved up and down to control the flow, the backing up of water behind the rollers. If the roller is lowered into the water, it backs up the water and then it goes into the canal into the Grand Valley. If this roller is raised up, then the water goes under the roller and doesn't get backed up behind the roller. So this is a picture of one of the rollers being in the raised position. You can see that it's not backing up water and the water is running under it. This is actually the roller at the fish ladder on the roller dam, which I'll be talking about here more in a minute. This is an aerial photo of the roller dam. We were just a minute ago right down here looking at the roller dam. You'll see that there are 7 bays in the roller dam, each with a roller in the bay. The fish ladder has been constructed in bay number 1. This is the interstate up here at the top of the photo. So the first bay that you can see when you're driving by an interstate has been taken out of commission and has had a fish ladder constructed on it. My yellow arrow here is pointing to the fish ladder itself. Just to orient you, the Colorado River is flowing down westerly towards the Grand Junction area. The roller dam backs up water into the government HIGHLINE canal that then goes down into the Grand Valley. I'll be talking more about the HIGHLINE canal and a fish screen on that in a minute. So the fish screen is a mile or so downstream on the HIGHLINE Canal. But let me switch over to show you the fish ladder first. This is the fish ladder or fish passage on the Colorado River on the roller dam. What happens is water is released into this structure from right up in this area, and it flows down gradient in this fish ladder all the way down to the Colorado River. And so this is where that water comes out. You'll see it coming out of the fish ladder here. This is called an attractor flow because it attracts the fish to this area. The fish will be attracted to this flow of water coming in and will start their journey up the fish ladder at this point here. You'll see the roller here that's been raised to make room for the fish ladder. So this is a view of the fish ladder in operation. It's fully charged with water coming from upstream on the Colorado River. The water just flows down and goes back and forth down to the Colorado River. And then the fish swim upstream through these holes in the fish ladder. That's another view of the fish ladder in operation. And there it is with the water not flowing through the fish ladder. So you can see what each of those little structures looks like. That shows you the scale of the fish ladder. These little structures are about 6 feet tall. And what happens is when the fish get to the top of the ladder, they swim through this little opening, and then this down here is a holding tank that the fish get trapped in. And so periodically, folks from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will turn off the water flowing into the fish ladder, and will then come down and net the fish in the holding tank. You can see a couple of them swimming around here. So they'll net all of these fish and take them up to a sorting table. And with luck, there will be some endangered fish that they've captured in this fish ladder. They will make sure those fish are tagged so they can keep track of them. They'll take other measurements about the size and health of the fish, and then allow them to continue their journey upstream on the Colorado River. For example, the pike minnow, its historical habitat was all the way up to the rifle area. So as long as that roller dam has been in place, they've been prevented from accessing parts of their historical habitat. The other fish that they sort out, there will be some native Colorado fish that aren't endangered that will go back in the river. If there are any of the non-natives, I'm not sure exactly what happens to them, but I think they get thrown back, way back, and are not allowed back in the river. It's a fairly labor-intensive process. The Fish and Wildlife Service, when the fish ladder is turned on, will need to come out fairly often and shut off the fish ladder, empty the holding tank, and sort the fish. So it's a fairly interesting process to watch them doing this. And the fish ladder doesn't operate all the time. It basically operates during high flow periods when there's sufficient water in the river to make sure that the irrigation diversions into the HIGHLINE Canal are not adversely impacted. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was a fish screen that has been built on the HIGHLINE Canal. The roller dam and the fish ladder is to the left on this photograph, somewhere between a half mile and a mile upstream. And this is the HIGHLINE Canal coming down here. This is a photo of the fish ladder being constructed. Here's another photo of it showing the HIGHLINE Canal coming into the fish ladder, or the fish screen, I'm sorry. And the idea is these gates, when the fish screen is in operation, will be opened. The water will flow through the screen. Fish will be screened out in each of these legs of the W. When they're screened out, they're put in a pipeline and run back to the river. and that basically keeps them out of the canal so they don't become trapped in the canal and die in the canal. You'll see this bypass channel, so at times when the fish screen is not being operated, water can still make it down to the Grand Valley. It'll be bypassed around the screen itself and continue on down to the Grand Valley. Mary, I see you're open. Is there a question?
Yeah, just a second. Yeah, got one question here. The fish ladder at the Redlands Canal has a nearly identical setup. Holding tank, fish sorting, etc. WFS also tags individual fish for studying migrations, and the sorting allows them to track and examine those tagged fish. So a comment there from Alexander.
Absolutely, that's very correct. And I'm more familiar with the Colorado setup, so that's why I focused on that. But you're right, there's a sorting table there, and they keep track of endangered fish too, and their migration habits. Good comment. So here's a more close-up photo of the fish screen during construction, showing the gates coming into the screen and the two legs of the W where the screens will be constructed. Here's a photo of the fish screen in operation. This photo was taken standing right up here, looking down this way. So that shows the screen in operation, the water flowing through. This is one of the legs of the W here. The other leg of the W is over here. This is what the screens themselves look like. The screens have a very fine mesh so that they sort out not only adult fish, but also larvae, and send everything back to the Colorado River. The fish will be taken out down at the end here and put into a pipeline and sent back to the Colorado River. And the water has flowed through these screens and will continue on down canal to serve the Grand Valley irrigation water. There are scrubbers on these screens. I think this is one of the scrubbers here that move back and forth continually while the screen is in operation to scrub the dirt and twigs and other trash off of the screen so that they don't get plugged up. That's one of the screens in operation. You can see the water that's gone back into the canal here. That's gone through the screen and is making its way back to the canal. Then the fish go down the end there in the pipeline back to the Colorado River. The last thing I wanted to talk about in terms of habitat restoration are what are known as canal checks. These are adjustable dams on the government HIGHLINE canal. I think there are 12 or 13 of them along the length of the government HIGHLINE canal. One of the problems with a big canal like the government HIGHLINE canal is that most of the takeouts from the canal for people who want to irrigate their lands are located near the top of the canal bank. And so that means generally the canals needed to be run full all the time, even if water demands were down, so that people could get their water out of the canals. The purpose of the canal checks is to allow the water to be backed up in the canals to keep water at bank full without having the full supply of water run through the canal. This is another picture from the back side of the canal checks. And basically these little devices here get lowered into the water. And when they do that, it backs up the water supply behind them and brings the water up to bank level. And basically these checks allow the canals to be operated with a lower amount of water running through them and still be operated efficiently. And so what this means is that we don't have to divert as much water into the government HIGHLINE canal all of the time. During lower demand periods, the water can be backed up using these checks, and the water that is not needed can be left in the river to help flows in the 15-mile reach. So these canal checks can be operated remotely from the offices of the Grand Valley Water Association, Water Users Association. And so they monitor these checks continually to make sure that the water is at the appropriate level. And these checks have really saved a lot of water for the 15-mile reach over the period of time since they've been installed. I think they were installed in the late 1990s, early 2000s. You'll see this picture was taken in 2002. So I think on average, it's been like 30 or 40,000 acre feet of water a year that's been not diverted into the canals and been allowed to run through the 15-mile reach. So that's a pretty substantial water savings just because of these check structures. So let me tie up here. Is the recovery program working? We've had almost, we spent almost $500 million to date trying to recover the endangered fish. And one of the big issues is, what is the definition of recovery? How do we know when these fish have been recovered so they can be taken off of the endangered species list? We have seen improvement in the populations of the razorback sucker and the humpback chub. The Fish and Wildlife Service has recently proposed downlisting both of these fishes from endangered to threatened. There's still work that needs to be done to recover them, but there has been some improvement in their populations. One of the problems is that federal funding for the recovery program efforts expires in 2023. A large portion of the funding for the recovery program and some of these improvements that I've talked about has come from the federal government. The goal has been to recover the endangered fish by the time that funding ran out in 2023, but that's not going to happen. So there are ongoing discussions among the recovery program participants as to what's going to happen post 2023. Future issues include, where would the funding come from? How do you continue these protections for the endangered fish? You know, the reservoir releases, the operation of the fish screens, the fish ladders. How does all that continue into the future? How long will the program need to continue to recover the fish? And then how do you determine if the fishes have been recovered? Obviously, you want to have self-sustaining populations, but how many fish is that? How do you determine if they're recovered is a big issue that people are discussing. Then finally, one thing I wanted to mention is the recovery program provides Endangered Species Act compliance for over 2,400 federal, private, and tribal water projects. If the recovery program ends without recovering the fish, these projects may not be able to continue. That includes the irrigation projects here in the Grand Valley. They may have to curtail diversions or stop diversions altogether. So there's a major incentive for all parties to continue the program and ultimately recover the endangered fish so they no longer need the protections offered by the Endangered Species Act. We'll see what happens in the future. 2023 is a critical date, and I know folks are working hard to determine what's going to happen after that. So that's the end of my presentation. I'd be happy to take any more questions that folks may have.
Sure, yeah, Mark, thank you so much. I found that to be so interesting, and although I see this infrastructure that we have in the Grand Valley daily, I really did not realize the complexity of the marvel that we have here. I'm going to unmute all, and if anybody has a question, they can feel free to stay unmuted and ask questions themselves. So please feel free to open your mics if you'd like. And Lorian, I see that you've got a question. Would you like to ask that of Mark?
Sure. Thanks. Thanks, Mary. And thanks, Mark. That was fascinating. I wanted to know, it seems to me, given kind of the way that water is used around here, and the fact that it takes some attention to maintain this critical spring flow. Is it basically the case that for there to be sustained recovery of these fish, there'd have to be attention to those spring flows just from now into whenever the foreseeable future?
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Lorian. And it's not only the April hole that has to be paid attention to, it's all of these things that will need to continue indefinitely into the future. They've all been critical in maintaining the populations to date, and they're going to be critical in ultimately recovering the fish. So that's one of the challenges, is that it takes cooperation and funding to continue these things. And so that's what people are talking about, is how does that cooperation continue in the future, and where does the funding come from?
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
And Marjorie has a question. I've asked her if she'd like to just go ahead and ask that of you, Mark.
Yes, Mark, and again, really, really fascinating information. It's really, really excellent. Thank you. My question is, are only federal funds used for these different programs?
No, the feds have been the primary funding source, but the state of Colorado has provided funding. Individual irrigation companies have provided funding. So it comes from a variety of sources, but the federal financing is the primary source, or it has been in the past.
Okay, thank you.
When you have $500 million in expenditures, that's beyond the reach of the state of Colorado and the other states and private entities involved. So you need the federal funding to make this happen.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Any other questions? Okay, Mark, thanks so much. We appreciate it. This is a wonderful way to spend a lunch hour. Really, really good information, and I'm excited to learn more. We've got 2 more webinars coming up this spring, one with our board member Brad Banulis from CPW, and that will be coming up on April 28th, and he will be talking about wildlife habitat in western Colorado and conservation of that habitat. And then Mark will have another webinar on May 13th. Talking about Trans Mountain diversions and other Colorado River water rights. So thanks so much for everybody. I hope you have a good afternoon.